So just a little bit about the history of Venables Street, and just a grab bag of about 24 slides. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. And as I just pointed out, I did work on the Vancouver Street Names book with Elizabeth Walker. It was a book, it's actually for free online now if you want to look at it, Street Names of Vancouver. And it's the origins of 1,300 Vancouver street names. 800 of which I think are defunct now, but we still have Venables. And Venables Street, where we worked on the book, Venables Street was one of the street names that we really didn't know where the name came from. And there was only one attempt to explain it, and that was, there was a fellow by the name of Venables that was in the Caribou in the 1860s for 2 years. So, well, this street didn't get named until 20 years after that, and he was long gone, so it's a bit of a stretch to think that it was named after him. But, James, you were making a comment about Captain Cavendish Venables. And what was it again?
Well, he, my favorite thing about it was that he had concocted a, it sounded like a cocktail, which I was, if I had had a couple of hours this afternoon, I would have prepared it and brought it all so that all of us could sample it. I
This
didn't
is
get
what
a
he was
chance
known
to get
for.
a license.
If you
What's
wonder
that?
what went on in the 1860s during the gold rush, this is one of the highlights of the gold rush.
Yeah, and so what this thing was, what he drank was he put radishes and whiskey together. I think so, that was out of that book. Here we are. Radishes and whiskeys together, and then he chilled it, and then that's what they drank.
So James is hoping that it was named after him because he sounds like an interesting guy.
Yeah.
But actually, I was able, just recently, actually, when I went to work on my, I actually got 4 stories in the Grandview Woodlands book. In one of those stories, I answer the question about the origins of Venables Street, because I think I found out actually where the name came from. So we'll get to that in a second. But what we're dealing with right now is the Grandview Woodlands Community Plan, and this is the latest version of it, I guess, June 2013, Emerging Land Use Directions. And what do we got for Venables Street? Well, it's this area here, of course, and it's blank. So I guess that means they're leaving it alone. Because the city does want to encourage leaving industrial lands alone, because industrial lands have a lot of jobs in them, and they don't want to eliminate the jobs from the city and just make it a bedroom community. So that's supposedly what that represents. Although, if you look carefully, you may notice it's not entirely blank. So if you just take a closer look, there is this, the Astorino site on our main intersection here, Commercial and Venables, and it is planned to be 12 to 15 stories. And then Jack King astutely noticed that across the street, there's this little thing here, and that's mixed use up to 6 stories tall. So there would be a major change at that intersection to two towers, I guess, which is a little bit hard to believe because those sites seem pretty small, but this is what the plan is. And the only other thing is just a couple of trees on the bikeway here. And, you know, I mean, we've already got street trees all over the place, so, I mean, there are already street trees along the bike route here, I think, but anyhow. Okay, so, but this is, if you look down at the bottom, I got the air photo there, and you can see this is Venables and Commercial here, and that this is all sort of one-story, you know, fairly big, flat, one-story industrial buildings. The southern part is broken up a bit with sort of a few retail spaces. And when I did my book on Vancouver, here's what it looks like from 1990. So here, every map I got the same arrow, the Venables and Commercial intersection. So now that it's interesting, you know, air photo, it's this sort of, you know, everything's a gray building. But if you go by land use, you can see now the commercial strip that is Commercial Drive, and there is a bit of retail. I just generalized it into one color or another. So the south side of the street has got a bit of retail on it, and that's how it comes up. But notice the residential part of Grandview, and the east of Commercial Drive is, of course, all single-family dwellings pretty well, except for these areas that are zoned apartment, and they're starting to fill up with apartments over here. That's because the land was rezoned to apartment. So, and the other major thing you probably don't notice when you drive down Venables is the enormous presence of Britannia Community Center, where we are right now, of course. It's actually a huge site, 18 acres. And that's a factor in what goes on with Venables. As a matter of fact, when I was on the board at Britannia, we talked about, you know, the redevelopment of Britannia's site. And I remember the chair of the park board came and said, you know, they own a big chunk of the land that Britannia sits on. He said, we're open to any idea. We're open to any suggestions, you know. So I'll just mention that there is this idea that, well, maybe we can do something better, more interesting, you know, to tie Britannia into the Venables side of things, which sort of gets completely forgotten about because you come out Venables, you don't know Britannia's there. You just can't see it, so you don't think about it. So that is kind, and there's the track there. That is kind of a, you know, and it's interesting to see this view of it. And notice also you got this residential, but here you got this massive industrial area. This sort of gives you the edge of Grandview, if you like, at least where people live. That sort of defines the edge of it. Okay, well, let's not forget about what's been happening for the last 10,000 years. Up until 150 years ago, up until 150 years ago, you know, there has been First Nations people living here for about 10,000 years. Funny how it never seems to come up. But, you know, they did have this bay here named Kapeye, which actually is the First Nations word for cedar tree. Now, why would that be when there were cedar trees everywhere? Well, because very large cedar and hemlock. Now, of course, you would never know that today. There's not only no trees at all, first, you know, or native plants, if you want to call them that. There's not only none of them left, but there's not even a memory of what was there. And I'll just mention, you know, some other mammals here: muskrat, porcupine, chipmunk, flying squirrel, bat, deer, mouse, pack rat, vole, mole, and shrew. These never come up either, most of them. You know, wild pea, you know, all this kind of 13 great big elk were killed right here during the gold rush. Beaver dams all over the place, bears, seals, killer whales. There's all this stuff going on, plus all the native sites. These are native sites, they've been named. And so you got actually I just have to mention it, right where we are right now and along Venables Street, with some of the finest lumber in the whole world, one of the finest forests in the world. That's why white people came here, non-natives came here, was to cut down the trees. And by the way, the first thing we did was build a sawmill right there, where it says big leaf maple trees. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about. You know, cedar trees 18 feet across, Douglas firs, that's a woman there, and this is at Georgia and Granville in Vancouver. You know, a fir tree, you know, they grew to be almost 400 feet tall, upwards toward 400 feet tall. This is the finest lumber in the world at the time. And I'll just say it, there was a timber rush to Vancouver that probably made more money for the people that got in on it than was made in the gold rush, because this is very valuable work, very valuable wood. And by the way, these very valuable trees, Douglas firs, old growth, 500,000-year-old trees, are 99% gone now. Okay, so Venables Street, there it is. This is a 1907 map. I think Venables Street was named in the 1890s. But notice now in this map, these are district lots that are 160 acres, and these were preemptions, right? You were allowed to stake off 160 acres in the 1860s, and if you improved it, you moved onto the land and built a cabin or something, they would sell you the land for $1 an acre. So the original buyers of this land got it for $1 an acre. Now, this was the middle of nowhere, of course, until, well, the city of Vancouver was formed in 1886. It was the middle of nowhere until about 1882, 1883, when the insiders knew that they were going to build the railway across Canada and land it right here. Now that's a huge change. You're basically going from a place like Bella Coola to like San Francisco overnight. And so of course the insiders bought up this land. Now, how much money did they make? Well, the ones that got it for $1 an acre, some of them lived to see it rise in value to $10 million an acre, from $1 to $10 million an acre. Maybe not right here, but right here. So, okay, so here's the only name. Here's Park Drive, Commercial Drive, and there's Venables. These are the two streets because of the streetcar. And so where did the name Venables come from? Has anybody here got any Irish ancestry? We got Irene? Irene does, despite the name Mosca.
Me.
Irish? Who else?
Me.
Yeah, Jack, how about you? Yeah, lots of people. Look at these Irish types. Okay, lots of people.
Okay,
Okay, I'll tell you a little bit of Irish history. Maybe I'm getting it wrong, so feel free to interrupt and contradict me. But here we go. So, just before you get on to that, so these guys bought the land. This little group of insiders bought the land in 1883, and here's Venables Street is the bottom border, and they amalgamated these three lots, and they carved it up. Now this is when nobody knows that the railway is coming to Vancouver, but they do. So they got it for not much more than $1 an acre. Who were these people? Powell, Crease, Mara, Bodwell, Vernon, O'Reilly, Dudney, Barnard, and Eichmann. Well, almost all of them were MLAs, members of the Legislative council. We've got a Supreme Court Justice, Attorney General. 3 of them were members of Parliament, as well as being members of the legislature. The CPR paymaster, the Commissioner of Lands and Works, a guy by the name of Vernon. You may have heard of Vernon, BC. Okay, and so it's all the insiders. Powell from Powell Street, Powell River. We were just talking about Powell Street.
Yeah.
Powell River. He, anyhow, he was head of the Department of Indian Affairs, the very first one. It's actually Powell was responsible for our whole educational system. Anyhow, and then Barnard was a senator. Well, he turned down the senatorship because he was too sick. But NPM, and then he was the guy who started the big stagecoach company that went into the Caribou during the gold rush. Okay, so you got this really interesting history to this area of all these very well-known people if you read BC history. So, okay. Now, here's an early map. This is when they're just carving the land up into acreage. This is before there was really any people living around here. So, when you carve up, so if you look at Venables Street, the first person to build Venables Street through their property was the guy that owned this chunk of land and this chunk of land. So that, and the Venables Street is a dividing line. So that it was carved up into A, B, C, D, and obviously C and D weren't developing their land at all, and E. And then same thing down here. So he bought 2 parcels, A and H down here, I think. So he got to name the streets. When you develop real estate, you get to divide up into streets and name the streets. People quite often say, "Oh, this was named in honor of Mr. Vernon." No. That's not what happened. Vernon owned the land, named it after himself. So Vernon, who bought this land, his name is Forbes George Vernon. So what do you think he named the streets? Forbes, George, and Vernon Street. So Forbes Street was up here where BC Sugar Refinery is. It's gone now. And then if you go to Casa Gelato, which is right about here, there's a George Street here. And this is where 1000 Parker is. We're right in here. And then George, that's George Street. And then Vernon Drive, of course, is the big long street. Where is it? Vernon Drive is, I put them in yellow here. The streets are in orange, I mean. So here's Vernon Drive, comes down there, goes down there, and keeps going down across False Creek. And this is Clark Drive, just to get bearings. This is Clark Drive, Venables, and then Commercial coming down where the arrow is. Okay, so who is Forbes George Vernon? And he got to name, all these rich people got to name our streets. Well, he was the first person to build an orchard in the North Okanagan. Now, obviously that was First Nations territory. He ended up with 13,000 acres of the land around a place called, go for it, Vernon. He named the town after himself.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest fruit producers in the British Empire. And he sold it to the Duke of Aberdeen or some royalty in Britain. And so he was the MLA. Back then it was a member of the Legislative Council. MLA for Vernon, BC. So just on the topic of Irish history, let's just, because we have a bunch of Irish people here, I'll just remind you that Commercial Drive, if you look at the 1911 census, almost everybody that lived here was either Irish, English, Scottish, or Welsh. 90% of people here were either born in Great Britain or their parents were born in Great Britain. They're all British immigrants, almost all of them. Just a few from Germany and a few other people. Okay, so if you look at the history of Commercial Drive, my story in that book, I have a short story there on Irish pioneers of Commercial Drive, or Grandview, Irish pioneers of Grandview, and there's 3 of them. McSpadden, McSpadden Street, McSpadden Park was, and then McSpadden actually owned Grandview Park. He actually owned the whole block there. And he had his house in Grandview Park, McSpadden did. He was Irish. Clark, at Clark Drive, E.J. Clark, and this is why Commercial Drive was called Park Drive, because it went to the land that E.J. Clark donated. The second park in Vancouver after Stanley Park. He donated the land down at 15th and Commercial. It was called what? Clark Park, right? Okay. So the third guy is Vernon, who is a big factor in the street names, at least, of this area. And he, of course, he named them all after himself. Okay, now, just to get on where the name Venables comes from, it's interesting. We got he's naming all these streets, and then Venables Street gets named at the same time. Now, do you think maybe he named Venables Street, that Vernon did? Well, why would he call it Venables Street? Okay, well, let's find out. Now, just before we move to the next slide, I'll just remind you that when we're talking about Irish history, 1,200 years ago, Ireland was just a bunch of peasants living on the island of Ireland. There were no towns, really. There were no towns to speak of. It was just peasants in the countryside with a few monasteries the church had wealth, they had monasteries, they had sort of big farms, and they had a lot of wealth compared to the peasants. They were farmers. So really all you got is farmers and monasteries. So I guess this is 1,200 years ago. So guess what happens in 795 AD? The Vikings discover Ireland. Ooh. So here's what happens. In their search for plunder, Vikings, let's call them Scandinavian pirates. That's my term. They discovered Ireland in 795. Now we're going to end up at Venables here. So hold your, try and follow this. The Vikings used to raid Ireland, and they just go marching or flying right through Ireland to raid the monasteries, to pillage them of their gold. And on the way to the monasteries, which are sort of inland, they would gather slaves and anything else they could rob, because they're pirates, and because it was completely undefended, if you like, just peasants in the country. So they go looting the monasteries of their treasure and livestock, as well as taking slaves. You know, they're doing this decade after decade. Eventually they got all this stuff. Well, it's like almost like a flea market. You know, eventually you gotta get organized and establish permanent bases along the coast where you go to and from and you sell your stuff. These bases for raiding also served as trading centers for newly acquired slaves and their stolen goods. The Viking plunder centers developed into Ireland's first true towns. The Vikings founded Ireland in 841, Cork 846, Waterford 850, and Limerick in 922. The Vikings are responsible for founding Ireland's towns. Okay, so eventually the Irish people get pissed off and they get tired of it and they get organized. And finally, it goes on for a few decades, but finally Brian Boru in 1014 finally defeats the big Viking army, which, by the way, they brought from Denmark and Sweden and Norway. They brought a whole pile of people over to put down Brian Boru and his buddies. And they lost. The Vikings lost at Clontorf, which is right near Dublin, just on the edge. It's in Dublin, actually. Clondorf Castle was constructed in 1174. And by the way, it became a base of the Knights Templar. So we're talking about the elites back then. In 1649, after the English invasion of Ireland under Oliver Cromwell, Clondorf Castle, this is it here. Whoop, up here. Where'd my light go? Oh, my light's gone. Already gone. Oh, there we go. This is Clondorf Castle here. 1649, under Oliver Cromwell, Clondorf Castle became the property of a guy named John Vernon, Cromwell's quartermaster general. This is what happens when you invade a country. You get to carve it up and give it to your soldiers. So Vernon got Clondorf Castle, became the ancestral home of the Vernon family for over 300 years. Well, more than that, actually. I don't know where they got. Oh, yeah, 1649. Okay, so now that's bringing us up into the 1900s, 1950s or something. So Forbes Vernon, this is where Forbes Vernon was born. The guy named Vernon Drive and George Street and Forbes Street. And he was the son of none other than John Venables Vernon. I think we can assume he named Venables Street after his father.
So no radish cocktail.
No, out with the radish cocktails. Although I say we have radish cocktails. Anyhow, close enough. Okay, so quickly, just here's Venables Street in 1912, and it's completely residential. There's houses on both sides of the street, except for this apartment building here, the Sandon Block, you know, where Uprising Bakery is. And notice Commercial Drive jogs here and goes up that way. It doesn't go through like it does today. So we got the diversion here now. So this corner was the entrance to Commercial Drive, if you like. You come from Vancouver, you turn, now you're entering Grandview, really, or coming down Grandview's main street when you get to this, as I said, major intersection. And by the way, did the ocean ever get near Venables Street? Venables Street goes down, you know, it jogs into Prairie now. Just on the other side of the railway tracks, it does a jog. Well, originally it just butted in. It ended, and then you turned and went over to Prairie. So how close to the ocean did Venables Street get? Well, the ocean went under. It went under Venables Street. So now, and there's Prairie. So again, they smooth this out. You come down, you cross the railway tracks here, and then you zig and zag over to Prairie. You do that, you know how you woo, you know. And then you come around the corner, there's parked cars right there. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. So here we have Forbes, George, Vernon, and Venables all together, more or less. And then this is Casa Gelato is right. Is it there? Or there?
It's right at the.
It's right at the
beside
railway
tracks.
Yeah,
It's at
okay.
Glen Drive.
Okay,
Glen Drive,
so, and what is on top of the ocean here is 1,000 parkers. And by the way, you know the Chinese rest home?
Yes.
Built on the ocean, built over the ocean. And then 1,000 Parker, built over the ocean. Talk about waterfront property to build. They're built in the ocean. So, what do you call it? Water top, not waterfront property. A very good point.
Water tower.
Okay, so you can see again, there's all these big industrial buildings along here and there, okay, so, now one thing about, if you read the history of commercial driving, that picture book that those people did 10 years ago, there's this picture of this building that was on commercial, or sorry, not on Commercial Drive, but on Venables. This is one of your highlights of Venables Street, 1685, where is it? Where's 1685? 1685, thank you. 1685 Venables. Okay, now, these guys are tinsmiths, and by the way, tinsmiths made these cornices. These are called cornices, and those are supposed to be beam ends, the ends of the beams, but they're fake, but it's actually pressed metal. So this is what tinsmiths made, was pressed metal beam ends, and all this stuff is pressed metal. And even these things are pressed metal, the bay windows. And this is pressed metal. And this is pressed metal. So they're showing off their art. And they probably did all the cornices along Commercial Drive. So, but it's interesting what it says there. In 1925, this building was torn down because of the creation of the Commercial Drive diversion. Now, if that's true, what that means is that when you drove down, if they tore it down, that means it was sitting right here. And when you drove down Commercial Drive, you were looking right at this spectacular building. So that would have been a huge landmark. So I've always been kind of wondered how that could be when I've never seen any picture looking down Commercial Drive with this building at the end, because it would have been a real landmark feature. I mean, there's nowhere in Vancouver that has something like that. You're driving down the street and you got this, woo, holy cow, building in front of you. So, of course, I tried to investigate it, and here's what I came up with. So here we are, this is 1912 again, and you see Commercial Drive, the 1600 block ends at Commercial Drive, 1695 would be here, and then 1701 begins at Commercial Drive going east. So if you have an address of 1685, you might think, well, I guess that's right here. But guess what? You can't read the stupid addresses. So, I got a better copy. I went to the freaking trouble of driving down to the archives to get this better copy. And you can see what the confusion here is now. This is the 1600 block, but what do you do when you're naming 100 blocks when the street ends here? So they got 1697 there, and then they start the 1700 block here. So this is 1789, but this is 1733, just to confuse things. This is 1755. So now it's scrambled. So it turns out this is 1685 here. And if you look at it today, this is Uprising Bakery. Uprising Bakery. Build it. Now you got this.
Big improvement.
Well, this is, yeah, big improvement is called. This is good point, thank you. This is off the city website, the tax information. So this building was built in 1973. That's what that means. Big improvement. So I don't know when this got torn down or even why it got torn down. We don't know, or nobody knows. But there's the building permit for it. And again, 1685 Venables Street. This is the only building permit for this famous Geardy's tinsmith guy. He was the guy who started Grandview Sheet Metal, it's called, Grandview Sheet Metal Company. So they got the building permit. They built this building in 1912. And so that answers that little mystery.
Bruce, can I
Yep.
jump in?
Yep, jump in anytime.
Unless you're gonna talk about it now,
Yep, go ahead.
because the Grandview Sheet Metal Company, when they tore that building down,
When? Do you know?
then they built what is now Astorino's.
So you figure it's built, turned down in 1932?
Yeah, thereabouts, yeah.
Yeah.
And they were at Astorino's until Maglio's turned it into a dance hall in the sixties.
Yeah, I've been trying to confirm that. Because there is a picture, I don't have it here, at the back side of their sheet metal operation where they're showing off their smokeless furnace that they used to make.
So,
And it's not quite clear if it's that building or not, so, but anyhow, we'll try to get more. Yep,
yeah, go
In
ahead.
the 1950 interurban
movie, the BC Hydro Show.
Oh, yeah. Did they go by there?
The Interurban comes along there, and the building is still there in 1950.
Oh, neat, because I was going to look that up, yeah.
And it comes along, you can see it, you can see Uprising, and then
Wow.
I can send you the clip. I've got a clip. that
Great,
shows
great, thank
that
you.
little bit.
I was going to put it in there, yeah. I can add it if you send it to me, yeah. Great, thank you.
The Sandon building
Yep.
is an interesting name. It's, you know, where Sandon, BC.
Yeah,
is.
silver.
Yeah, it was a very, and at one point apparently it was the largest city north of San Francisco.
Yeah,
So I
great.
heard, served by railways.
And again, that's part of our history, because I actually thought, well, obviously the guy made his money in silver at Sandon and invested, but actually, the building permit for that building, remember Mayor Malcolm of Vancouver?
Yeah.
The Malcolm Bowl in Stanley Park, he was mayor in 1929. It was his brother, James Malcolm, that built that building. And they had the big, jam company, Malcolm Jam, and I guess the spaghetti factory in Gastown was one of their big warehouses, was the Malcolm building. So they were a very well-known family in Vancouver, the Malcolm family.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big wholesaler, grocery
Yeah.
wholesaler.
Grocery wholesalers, exactly. Empress Jam, all kinds of different products. So
So
he's the guy who
that-
built the building. I don't know why he called it the Sandon Block. Maybe that came later.
Where the Uprising Bakery is, that building, is that an original building?
That's what we're talking about. The Sandon Block. It's
Oh,
called the
Sandon,
Sandon Block,
okay.
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll catch up in a minute.
Yeah. Okay, so I just mentioned this landmark intersection, and let's say this is a landmark building in that every Italian, more or less, in Grandview for the last 40 years has had their wedding receptions there. And like our daughter had her reception there, and she married an Italian guy, and his parents had their wedding there, or their wedding reception there. I mean, it's a huge part of the history of the Italian history of Vancouver. And by the way, the two sons, Maglio's sons, or whatever, did not want to take over his catering business, so he sold it, and that's why the building is going to be torn down. But the two sons didn't want to do that business. Instead, they opened Via Tevere. That's where we get Via Tevere from.
Oh, I
Is them
see.
not wanting to do this. Yeah, we in the Grandview Heritage Group, Jack and a bunch of us, wouldn't mind this building being saved just because it's part of the streetscape of Vancouver. We're not really happy about them tearing down our old buildings and sticking up towers, so it looks like the downtown or Broadway or something. We'd like to keep our commercial drive character, and this is definitely part of it. Now, if you look across the street here, I seem to remember this building. That this gas station was on this is going up Commercial Drive, Venables here. This gas station was on the corner until they built that mini mall.
Yeah, I remember.
And it's like the one it's just like the gas station that was it 2nd or 3rd in Commercial. There is still a gas station like that. Huh?
I like photo barn. It's a photo repair.
Yeah,
That was run by the Higgins family from the 1910s on.
really.
But it's the same sort of structure with that.
Same as the other one. Yeah, same as the one down at 3rd and Commercial. And these are 50s cars. This is 1950s stuff. Well, 1955. 1955. Okay, so kind of a neat landmark building. And so here we are today, and instead we got this mini mall with a, what do you call it? No, who's it? But I'll just point out this house because the whole of Venables used to be residential. When you drive down there now, you go, hey, what's that house doing there? It's not supposed to be there. It's supposed to be a warehouse. But actually, this is what it used to look like. And we don't really have a picture of Venables Street showing these houses. This is like the only fragment we got of what was originally there. And it's just interesting. You might not think much of this house, but what's interesting about it is try and find another house that looks like this anywhere. It's sort of
It's a
unique.
lovely little house.
Yeah. I mean, in the whole of Grandview, there's not a house like that. I think it's 1907, 1908. So it's just interesting to notice that. Okay, and then the other, if you go up to Venables and Victoria, of course you got the 1912 Methodist Church here, and then we got our new, what do you call this? A brick or something? We got the new brick on the corner. And now they're planning to tear down the greenhouse here, which has a tarp on it. The greenhouse.
No, it has a hint of tarp remaining.
And unfortunately, I guess the plan is to build another brick, but so again, the people in the Grandview Heritage Group are not happy with this. We'd rather see this house saved on this historic streetscape. Okay, so this is out of my book, 1910. You can see what we call Grandview is this village, this streetcar village. And actually what developed ahead of Grandview was Cedar Cove. Funny, it's called Cedar Cove. Why was that? Because they built a whole pile of cedar mills there. Oh, why was that? Because those 18-foot cedars. That picture was the one at the end of Dundas here. That picture of that 18-foot cedar was literally on the same street as Cedar Cove. Okay, and there's Woodland Park. So you want to know where the name Woodland comes from. It's actually this area up here, which is not really part of Grandview. So I know that Grandview Woodland makes a nice local area name, but the neighborhood we live in is actually called Grandview, and this is not called Grandview Woodland. This is Cedar Cove. And there actually is no woodland, but if there ever was a woodland, it would be this little group of houses around the park here. But why would you call a fragment of Grandview woodland and then call the whole place Grandview? It's just stupid to have. I think it's stupid myself. Where we live is called Grandview, period. The local area is called Grandview Woodland, and the local area council covers Cedar Cove. Whatever the hell this thing is, there's no name for it, but you can sort of see the separation here. This is the east side of Strathcona coming in here. And today, again, we got this residential blob separated. You can see that the separator is this area here, 1920 even. It's still, you can still see a dividing line. This is the waterfront area. This is the commercial Grandview residential area. And what fills up, it's interesting how it fills up with the dividing, on the outer edge of Strathcona, the outer edge of Grandview, you get industrial where the jobs are, and there is no real woodland. But I'll just point out, just while we're here, that they're going to develop a whole new urban village here, and you might want to call it Woodland Village or Waldorf Village or something
You
like
mean
that.
the stuff they're doing down by the Waldorf, across the street?
The Waldorf, yeah, it's zoned to be 8 or 10 stories or something on that
All the way
Grandview.
along.
All the way
Yeah.
along, yeah.
The old
So
Canadian Tire site.
it's
Yes.
come back in 5 or 10 years. It's going to be a whole new, brand new condo city here, which has to have a name. You can't just call it Grandview Woodland. It's not. You can't call it East Hastings. People live there do not want to have it called East Hastings. East Hastings, you think, is the downtown east side. So anyhow, so it'll be interesting to see that. There's theoretically, I think, maybe I'm wrong. There should be a name for that area. Okay, moving along. So here's what you mentioned earlier. This little entry that actually won one of the contests about what to do with the area,
Yeah, there it is over
the
there.
flats, and you can see it's corner bulges and some landscaping, make the whole thing, because it is an industrial area, to try and make it more inviting and more human, if you like, or more living things like trees.